Hi, this is Jim. In this video, I will show you a little bit about how to think about the composition in your photographs from the concept of rule of thirds. There's been a lot of talk about the rule of thirds lately in photography, and almost everyone is using it. It's become very popular and very common, and it's important for you to know it, even if you don't want to always follow it or use it. So here's a little bit of quick background on what the rule of thirds is and where it came from. It's actually a very old concept. It came about in the late 1700s. It was in a book written by John Thomas Smith in 1797 called Remarks on Rural Scenery. And you can look it up and see what he had to say about this in the context of painting, landscape paintings. It was an idea of how to lay out the components or the parts of a painting in order to have a sense of balance in the image. As I said, it's become very popular today, and you'll see the rule of thirds applied very, very much in television and film and video. Everything involved with the moving image is really focused on the rule of thirds right now. And you'll also see it often used in still photography. As we talk about the rule of thirds, one of the things I'd like to mention is that, remember, it's a guideline. It's really not a rule. You don't have to follow it, but you should know about it. The other thing I'd like you to know is a little bit about the concept or the philosophy behind it, because we just sort of accept these things today like they're given, but really they were something that came about in the context of a historical period. If you know anything about the history of the arts or the history of the world, you know that right around the late 1700s, early 1800s, is the time when our country was founded. It's what's been called sometimes the classical period, or sometimes called the Age of Enlightenment. If you know anything about music history, this is the time when Mozart and Haydn and early Beethoven were writing their music, and it's very, very classical sounding. If you think about architecture, classical architecture was an attempt to go back to the ideas of the ancient Greeks, the symmetry and order of these Greek pavilions that involved the parallel columns. The classicism of the late 1700s and 1800s echoed that very directly. And you can see, if you know Monticello by Thomas Jefferson, for example, you know exactly what classical architecture looks like. It's very clearly symmetrical, lots of parallel lines, and a very strong sense of balance. If we look at the rule of thirds applied to photography, it's the idea that a photo or an image can be divided up into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, which creates 9 sections of the photo. It's the lines and the intersections of these lines that are most important. The idea with rule of thirds is if you place your horizon and your main subject matter on top of these imaginary lines, you'll be giving a sense of order to your photographs. But it's very easy to see how this idea of very pure symmetry is very much connected to the classical sense or the Enlightenment thought of the late 1700s. This was a time in history when science completely took over the religious point of view, and everything was very mathematical and very scientific. That's why there's the sense of balance and mathematical order in this concept, which is echoed very clearly in the balance and mathematical order of dividing the image in thirds, both horizontally and vertically. So it is a very classical, very mathematical Age of Enlightenment concept. It's not the only way to structure a photo, but it is one of the ways that many people structure their photos today. Another thing to think about with the rule of thirds is that it is really a trope at this point, or almost a cliche. By because the rule of thirds is used so much today by photographers and videographers, it's almost become the expectation that if you aren't at least aware of the structure of rule of thirds, the idea is that you really don't know about structure, or you don't know why you're doing what you're doing. Tropes are a very interesting concept. They have to do with things that become marketing. Cool, man, which is something that I say, or something that I often say is, yeah, that's really cool, man. That sort of places me in a certain sort of scene or a certain kind of era. I'm a jazz musician, so when I say, yeah, cool, man, other jazz musicians feel comfortable around me because I'm, in a sense, responding or expressing the tropes of that scene. I fit in to the jazz scene because I use the jazz language and can play jazz, of course, but it's the tropes that sometimes actually connect us with a certain scene. And if we aren't aware of those tropes, we can misuse them in ways that people inside that scene will notice and discount our work for. So we want to be aware of the rule of thirds, even if we don't always use it, because in a lot of contexts today, that is one of the measures of what makes a good photograph, for better or worse. If you're not using the rule of thirds, you need to know why you're not. And a lot of times, actually, the rule of thirds does work. So I want to show you now in this video the application of the rule of thirds to some of these photos. I'm going to start with this one that I took today of a flute player down on the Del Mar Loop. Now, I've been trying, but I haven't been doing all that great at getting the subjects of my photos a little bit off center. One of the reasons is that my focus point on my camera is right in the middle, and so I'm trying to make sure I hit that focus point. And unfortunately, then the subject ends up being right in the middle. But clearly, that doesn't follow the rule of thirds. So I'm using the Photos app on a Macintosh computer, but the Windows version is very similar. So I hit the crop button, and I'm going to go down here and hit aspect, hit original, because I want to keep the same relationship of the height and width, but I just want to change the edges. So as I pull in one of the edges of this photo, you'll see that the Photos app gives me the rule of thirds grid lines that I can use to help make my decision about how I want to crop this photo. As I pull it down, try to get the center of the man's face into this intersection point, the photo starts to look a little bit more like we think of it as a structured photo today. I'll revert back to the original. And then show you the cropped version. I think in this particular case, the cropped version is much better. It really gives what we would call the negative space, the space that doesn't have anything important in it, a balance with the positive space of the main subject. And again, thinking about line, the line of his flute pulls the eye towards his face. The lines in the negative space over here pull us towards his eyes. So the negative space, which is the space that doesn't have anything important in it and is often blurred out, balances the strong foreground positive space. So I would call that an improvement to the photo. This is another one of mine that I took this morning, and I'm going to hit the crop button and pull in this top right corner and try to line up the subjects along those vertical grid lines. As I do that, it just seems to kind of start to feel better. There's just so much wasted space over here. It isn't really doing anything in terms of balancing. But by giving those subjects, putting those subjects in a place where they're intersected by the grid lines really gives this photo a little bit more polish. Here's another one of mine from this morning. Same story. Not quite as bad because the foreground subject is off to the side a little bit, but when I pull the grid lines in, you'll see that he's a little bit too far over. I forgot to hit the aspect. So I'm going to pull this side in, try and get him a little bit at least onto the grid lines. To go all the way and try and get him to have his eyes and nose right there on the line, I think might be a little too much. One thing to be aware of when you're cropping photos, that you're actually making the photo less high resolution. If you crop this photo way, way down, just to the man's face, you'll see how it gets kind of grainy, and the quality is just really bad. So if I were to print that now, it would really look awful. So you want to crop as little as possible. So in this particular case, even though I could crop it down enough to get the man's face and eyes right on a grid line, I'm not going to quite go that far because I want to preserve some more of the resolution of the photo. So I'm going to get him close to the lines, but not quite there. I'm also trying to get rid of the whole word craft so that it's not like an advertisement for the store. Something like that. Let's take a look at Burgett's bicycle shot. Oops. So this is an example of cropping with the rule of thirds on a portrait or vertical frame. Oops. I did it again. In this case, let's see what we can do. See what we can do to try and get the main subject a little bit more into the center of the box. We're not going to be able to get the main subject onto a line, but we can maybe get the subject's head onto the line. And let's see if that looks any better. This is a tricky one. Maybe a little better there. As you can see, at least now we have the subject on one of the vertical divider grid lines. At least she's kind of on it. I'm not going to be able to get it and much better than that, I'm afraid. Maybe like that. Let's just see what that looks like. That's a pretty severe crop. We've reduced the quality of the image quite a bit at this point. That's a little nicer framing, but it might be too extreme. It might ruin the quality of the photo. So you have to make a judgment call about how far you can go with some of this stuff. This one, which I think is Devon's. Yeah. Oh. That's a neat photo. And we can mess around with the crop on that a little bit to try and find a way to put something important onto a grid line without doing too much cropping, because this is I just downloaded this from the website, so it's a very low resolution photo. It's probably much higher resolution originally. This is improved. It gives more reason to have had the head cropped off a little bit. The head was cropped off by accident in the shot, just because it was taken quickly, like a lot of stuff is. And then you feel bad about it when you're editing. You're like, I wish I had the whole head in the shot. Well, sometimes you can give reason for the head to not, the top of the head to not be there, perhaps by finding a way to line up something important along one of the rule of thirds lines, especially with the original, which would be higher resolution. That might be a good way to go. It's actually not too bad the way it is, in my opinion, but rule of thirds can sometimes help a little bit. Let's do this one, which is also Devon's, I think. Yeah. So looking at this from the standpoint of rule of thirds, it's already almost right on, which is one of the reasons why this photo is so strong. If you saw the video that I just made about line and perspective, the very strong lines and the very strong sense of convergence of the arm with the eyes gives this a lot of meaning. But when you look at it from another sense of structure, this time the rule of thirds, you see how the very strong line of the window falls right on that vertical grid line, and then the center of the figure falls right on the other vertical grid line. So this illustrates a strong sense of structure from two different methods. Let's look at Olivia's umbrella shot, and then we'll quit. So the umbrella shot is really pretty close too. As you can see, that right-hand vertical grid line is already on the subject. But we might want to pull in this top left corner just a little bit, just to see what it can do to run that right-hand vertical grid line right down near the center or on the center of the main subject, just to see if it tightens the look a little bit. Again, this is a low resolution version from the website. So I think that it does actually tighten the shot quite a bit, actually. Okay, so that's the concept of rule of thirds. Think about how these vertical and horizontal grid lines help you identify where to place your main subjects and provide positive and negative space. Here in this case, the positive space is the woman in the front with the umbrella. The negative space is the distance and the cars and the pavement a balance between these two is created by putting the main subject a third of the distance across in the photograph, giving positive and negative space balance. It's just another way to think about how to structure the composition of your photos, and it's important to recognize it. Once you know about the rule of thirds, you're going to see it everywhere. It's something that everybody is using, and a lot of times it's not a bad idea at all. That's it. See you later. Bye.